Hello, my name is Mark Dietrich. I'm the chair of the steering committee of the Alliance for American Rule of Law, which is a group of lawyers in the United States who have worked overseas to promote the rule of law overseas, but who are now concerned about the threats to the rule of law here in the United States. This is one of a series of conversations that we're having with rule of law practitioners and experts to talk about their experiences promoting the rule of law and what they are seeing and what they are concerned about in the United States. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Mary Noel Pepys, who also serves with me on the steering committee of AROL and is a longtime practitioner in the rule of law field. She has worked in a number of countries, from Bulgaria to Mongolia to Afghanistan and many places in between, and is also a practitioner of law in San Francisco, where she joins us from. Mary Noel, thank you for taking the time to talk.
Yeah. Well, good morning. It's morning here in San Francisco.
Thank you. I know you got up early to do this, so thank you very much.
Yeah.
Mary Noel, I'd like to start off by talking about your background and how you got into the field of rule of law promotion and what some of your early experiences were.
Oh, great question to start. I'd love to tell you this. It's kind of a story, but an interesting one for lawyers who practice law in the United States and all of a sudden had an opportunity to go abroad. In 1989, I watched with fascination the dismantling of the Berlin Wall. Never in my lifetime did I think I would witness the demise of communism. You know, how could societies reared with a belief in Marxist ideology shove one political system aside for the emergence of another? I mean, in full speed. How could millions of people accustomed to state subsidies of housing, food, employment, medical care, even vacations, suddenly assume the burdens of freedom, taking responsibility for their own lives? Well, so interesting. At the moment I had these questions, the American Bar Association was creating a program, ABA Sealy, Central and East European Law Initiative, that provided American attorneys with the opportunity to work pro bono in former communist countries. How fascinating, I thought, to participate in the birthing process of democracy. As you know, Mark, there were 28 countries during the same time period that had to undergo massive legal reform. New constitutions had to be written, drastically changing their legal system in order to embrace democratic values. Laws that formerly gave power to the state had to be sacked and replaced with new laws legalizing private commerce and market based economies. ABA Sealy wanted to help these countries in their legal reform process, and I wanted to be where the political action was. This is an
And
opportunity, I thought, indeed a challenge of a lifetime.
and where did that lead you initially? What were some of your first assignments with ABA Sealy, and what were your experiences?
Well, all right. So after deciding I'd join ABA Sealy if I could, I applied, and ABA Sealy asked me to work in Bulgaria. Well, of course, I had to find it on the map before I could respond, because after seeing that it was adjacent to Greece, a country whose food I love, I enthusiastically agreed to work in Bulgaria for 6 months. So at the time, I was practicing land use law in San Francisco. And in 1993, I moved to Bulgaria with the idealistic fervor of a 60s Peace Corps volunteer. I arrived in Sofia filled with hopes and dreams, but all I saw were gray skies, dull and dilapidated buildings, potholes large enough to sink trucks, and horrific emissions from buses and factories. During my first month in Bulgaria, I had to stand in long bread lines. I was only able to buy 2 types of cheese. That's all they had. I suffered through extremely cold temperature for over a month in my apartment, even though it was the beginning of winter. Sofia's central heating system had yet to be turned on throughout the city. At that time, heating had yet to be privatized. Once the city turned on the heat, it was kept on 24 hours a day. The only way I could regulate the heat in my apartment was to open the windows even during snowstorms. Now, this may sound intolerable to you, Mark, but I didn't choose this work for the comforts of home. Otherwise, I would have never left. I knew I was living during an historic time.
And what was some of your work that you were doing back in those days with the lawyers and judges in Bulgaria? What were you talking to them about? What were you working on? What was needed?
Yeah. Well, ABA Sealy directed us, all of us American lawyers who went abroad, to focus on 2 fundamental pillars of a democratic society: the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary. And shortly after I arrived, and so interesting since it was 1993, I was just among a handful of American attorneys in Bulgaria, and that time there were not European lawyers who worked with us. We were the only, as we said, the only game in town. I was sought after with a wide range of requests, often involving judicial reform, reform of the legal profession, and improving legal education. The questions that came to me just when I arrived: could I help judges develop a judicial training center? Could I teach members of the Bar Association about private practice, something attorneys had been forbidden to pursue under communism? Could I provide guidance to a law school dean seeking to design a curriculum on the U.S. Constitution? Often I was asked if I could review draft legislation for parliamentarians struggling to align their laws with Bulgaria's new constitution. I loved being part of this work. Absolutely loved it. The Bulgarians I worked with were euphoric to be rid of communism and to receive the legal assistance we provided. Every day for me was filled with different requests, a variety of a lot of activities, and many challenges.
Mary Noel, I know that after your time in Bulgaria, you continued to work on the rule of law and promoting independent judiciaries in many, many countries overseas. What were some of the lessons that you learned from those experiences? And I would add, from my work in the region, I felt I always learned more about our own system from working in these other systems. But what were some of the experiences and lessons that you learned from working in these other countries overseas?
Well, I'd love to answer that, and I agree with you with what you learned about our work overseas. We learned probably more about the U.S. than we did about the countries overseas. But I'd just like to first say all the countries I did work in with ABA Sealy, and thereafter just a summary. But because I have to say that because of the exciting and unique work I had in Bulgaria, I unexpectedly found my passion. So I extended my 6-month commitment to 1 year in Bulgaria, and then spent the next 4 years working pro bono for ABA Sealy, living 1 year each in Latvia and Slovakia, and a total of 2 years in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Croatia. I just couldn't get enough of this work. And after my 5 years with ABA Sealy, I returned to San Francisco in 1998. A decade later, I moved to Afghanistan to work as the justice advisor at the U.S. Embassy Kabul. And when I wasn't living abroad, I was home based in San Francisco working as a consultant in the developing democracies in Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East. And that's until USAID was dismantled just 7 months ago. My work came to a screeching halt as it did with thousands of other workers, U.S.-based and foreign workers around the world. Now, if you'd like to know, I can move on to the work I did and what I learned abroad. I learned, and it's this feels quite emotional to me now in the United States. I learned not to take the foundational constitutional principles of the rule of law and an independent judiciary for granted, as I had done in the United States. While abroad, I learned from judges and attorneys who experienced firsthand the absence of the rule of law and the absence of an independent judiciary. As you know, Mark, under communism, the law was not supreme. Judges were not accountable to the law, but to the Communist Party. Those who governed were all powerful, and the law was subject to their whim and caprice. Judges were considered puppets of the government and became accustomed to party leaders who would routinely call them and advise them how to rule in particular cases. As you well know, Mark, this practice became known as telephone justice. All it took was just one phone call. Oh, that reminds me, when I was working in Croatia, the judges facetiously bragged about their progress as a modern country. They told me that their telephone justice had been digitized, and they began to call it SMS justice. So, since the rule of law was absent under communism, judges who resisted telephone justice faced the loss of benefits, demotion, even dismissal, and those who complied were rewarded with tangible advantages. So I wonder, Mark, if you had the same opinion that I have now, because as I look back, it's interesting that although new constitutions and laws embracing democratic principles were in place, one of ABA Sealy's greatest challenges, which we didn't anticipate, was helping judges break free from years of ingrained dependence. They simply weren't accustomed to making decisions on their own.
Yeah, I think that corruption was endemic in that system, and the telephone justice was a part of the overall corrupt and the corruption in the system. And, that is something that you can't necessarily legislate around. It requires goodwill, it requires traditions, and it requires commitment, and in some cases, bravery. Uh, can you talk more about your experiences with combating corruption in your career?
So I'm glad you asked that, Mark, because I've now worked in over 45 countries abroad, and a big portion of my time was spent on understanding the cause of judicial corruption in all these different countries and trying to devise remedies for it. Now, as we all know, a judge should be guided by only the facts of the case and the applicable law. There should be no improper pressures, whether from outside influences or even from within the justice system. And I think you experienced it as I did. Many of the pressures came from even within the judicial system itself. Now, in the US, we often equate judicial corruption with a bribe. But a judge's decision can be distorted in many other ways, which I became acutely aware of while abroad through favoritism, political interests, political pressures, familial pressures, or career incentives. Corruption is not always visible. It can be quiet, it can be insidious. What I experienced abroad is that when a justice system, even one that is formally independent, develops a reputation for issuing questionable rulings, public trust begins to crumble. I witnessed countless pressures on judges to ignore or bend the law, pressures at that time that were almost unheard of in the United States. For instance, judges abroad were often pressured into issuing improper rulings out of fear for their own safety. A judge in Kosovo once confided in me that he feared for his life after acquitting a Serb defendant accused of killing a Kosovar. Now, that evidence simply did not support a conviction, yet the case came just after the Kosovo War, when hostility towards Serbs ran high. Judges in several countries admitted to me that they often wrestled with whether to alter their rulings simply to avoid vilification by the public or the press. Many feared that issuing a legally sound but unpopular decision would jeopardize their professional success. I have concerns about the judiciary in the U.S. today based upon what I learned abroad.
Please
Yeah.
tell us what your current concerns are now that your international work has come to an end, and you're now focusing on some of the issues that we're facing here in the United States. Tell us what your concerns are.
Yeah, well, I have deep concerns. I have deep concerns because today in the United States, judges have faced physical threats designed to intimidate them. In recent years, some federal judges, as you know, Mark, received unordered pizzas accompanied by menacing messages that the sender knew where the judge and his family or her family lived. More tragically, I think you remember in 2020, a disgruntled lawyer murdered the son of federal Judge Salas while posing as a delivery driver. Such threats as these that aim to pressure judges can distort justice, undermining both judicial integrity and the rule of law. Today, in the United States, unpopular court rulings, even from the Supreme Court, are increasingly met with public scorn, diminishing confidence in our judiciary as an independent branch of government. Now, to be clear, I am referring to unpopular, not inaccurate court decisions. When the public begins to believe that legally sound but unpopular decisions arise from judges' political leanings rather than from the facts of the case and the law, our justice system will begin a downward spiral that threatens the very foundation of our rule of law. And you may know, Mark, that just 1 month ago, the Pew Research Center poll showed that the U.S. Supreme Court's job approval rating is near a historical low. 51% of Americans hold an unfavorable view, 49% a favorable one. And it pains me to acknowledge this because, and I do feel this very deeply, because when I began working abroad in the early 90s, like you, my American colleagues and I were able to make a tangible impact on the development of the rule of law and an independent judiciary, largely because our voices, our American voices, were respected and heard. The United States was seen as the shining city on the hill, the shining city on the hill, popularized by President Reagan, for we were the gold standard for the rule of law and judicial independence.
Thank you for that, Mary Noel. I would add that once that public trust is lost, and I think this is something we both saw overseas, it's really, really hard to gain. And I would also note that the threats that you mentioned against judges means that it's going to be hard to get good people to want to become judges. And then you go into a little bit of a a death spiral with the quality of our judiciary and our tradition of judicial independence.
Mm-hmm. Right. You're right.
Mary Noel, I know that you've been very active in speaking out
Mm-hmm.
about these issues in San Francisco and beyond. Can you tell us what you've been doing?
Yeah. Well, today I feel a profound responsibility to share with the American public just how precious the rule of law and an independent judiciary truly are. We all took it for granted. I know their value because I witnessed their fragility up close. I watched brilliant, committed, deeply ethical judges and lawyers struggle under relentless pressure to compromise their principles. And sometimes I felt their anguish as if it were my own. Today, Americans cannot take our rule of law or an independent judiciary for granted as I did 30 years ago. It is essential that every voice, I deeply believe this, it's essential that every voice, no matter how abhorrent it may seem to others, is protected under our Constitution. Safeguarding the rule of law is an active, ongoing responsibility, not a passive expectation like the ones we had in the past. And that is why I'm giving talks to local organizations within the Bay Area about why the rule of law and an independent judiciary are vital to our democracy, particularly in today's toxic political environment. So I'm after speaking about that, I end my talk with taking the audience on a journey of my professional life abroad by presenting a visual retrospective of the democracy work American attorneys have engaged in. Now, due to USAID's dismantling, its website no longer exists. There is no record of its 60 years of work. Its history has been wiped clean. So I'm using my own website, Pepys International. And although the photos and text reflect my personal experiences, they also serve as an historical testament to the extraordinary efforts of thousands of American attorneys who worked across the globe.
Mary Noel, what can we, the people, the citizens of the United States, do to protect and promote the rule of law and our independent judiciary and all the traditions that we hold so dear that have made such important contributions to our being a successful democracy?
That's a great question. Because you and I and other American lawyers who work overseas are taking that responsibility because we really experienced it, we feel it. But as I think about this, I think it's Americans should do what they should do, actually, is what they can do for themselves and their community. It is essential that all Americans, not just lawyers, all or judges, all Americans understand the deeper meaning of the rule of law and an independent judiciary. I'm not sure they understand it today. Just as I didn't understand it 30 years ago when I moved to Bulgaria. It was like air for me. It just always existed. I didn't have to expect it. These principles, although not named directly in the Constitution, are derived from it, and we hold them sacred. They are safeguards that protect every individual in the United States. Today, perhaps more than ever, these two principles can serve as a unifying force for a nation severely polarized by political ideology. They have the power to bring us together, no matter our political views or religious beliefs, because our most fundamental rights, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, equal protection, due process, are safeguarded by the rule of law and an independent judiciary.
Thank you, Mary Noel, and thank you for your time today, and thank you for your service in the overseas for so many years, and thank you for your work with AROL, and really appreciate what you're doing, what you have done, and what you continue to do in service of the rule of law.
Well, thank you, Mark, because you know who. Thank you for. I'm glad you appreciate my work, but the 5,000 American lawyers who volunteered overseas for ABA Sealy, that's a huge statement. That says how important American lawyers deeply believe in the rule of law and an independent judiciary. So I'd like to give a shout out to them as well.
And let's encourage them to speak out on behalf of the rule of law here at home.
They have the credibility to do so because they know what it's like not to have it.
Great. Okay. Thank you again, Mary Noel.
You're welcome. Thank you.